In 1682, the Palace of Versailles became the seat of French royalty. Louis XIV transformed the former hunting lodge into a symbol of the monarchy, meant to show off the glamorous life of a king by dazzling visitors with awesome gardens, vast halls, and phenomenal artwork. But Versailles was also a tightly and elaborately regulated world on its own. And like a piece of gaudy artwork or overly ornate furniture, etiquette in the court of Versailles was often more bizarre than dignified. Today, we're checking out the strangest rules of etiquette in the court of Versailles. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. And remember to leave a comment to let us know what other strange topics you want to hear about next. Okay, let's get our hands dirty. Court life in Versailles circa the 1600s was strict. Everything from dress codes to a timely schedule affected everyday life, and everyone knew where they stood in the hierarchy. But when it came to bathroom affairs, some courtiers didn't believe in privacy or even using a chamber pot. Today, urinating in public or like in the hallway is something you might expect from a rowdy talk show guest. But in Versailles, one princess just did it wherever she pleased. According to the memoirs of Louis de Rouvois, the Duke of Saint-Simon, Princess d'Harcourt just cut loose in the hallway whenever nature called. Her reasons for this are pretty strange, too. Apparently, she believed her blood was so pure that she could just relieve herself wherever she walked, and whenever she felt the urge. You know, like a horse. And the servants had to clean up after her. Talk about a crap job. The Duke paints a pretty negative picture of the princess throughout his memoirs. Not only did she have questionable bathroom habits, but she apparently inspired other courtiers to drop trow and let her rip whenever and wherever the need arose. That palace must have smelled like a play place at a strip mall McDonald's. Centuries before the invention of doorbells and ring cameras, knocking was arguably the #1 way for visitors to announce their presence or gain entry. You know, apart from diving through the nearest open window. Or closed window. But knocking was also considered rude in some parts of the world. For instance, in France, knocking was treated as a faux pas. It was considered rude to knock loudly on a door. And it was especially rude to knock on the king's door. Don't interrupt his private time. He's busy doing king stuff. To compensate for this, courtiers grew their fingernails out. So, instead of knocking, they would lightly scratch at the door to announce their desire to come in, like a rat's ghost. And we can all agree that's way less intrusive and upsetting than knocking. Louis XV decreed that only he and his immediate family could walk through an open door without scratching first. Maybe he felt people needed to be reminded who was king, in case the big hat didn't give it away. Or maybe he was just an a-hole. Most kings throughout history have been pretty fussy. It's an accepted part of the gig. But French kings in particular were especially big on ceremony during this time period. Not only was daily royal life highly orchestrated, but it also had special wake-up calls and a bedtime known as the lever and the coucher. During the coucher part of the day, nobles and various courtiers surrounded the king in his bedchambers as he drifted off to sleep. Wait, do they read him a story or... No, they just watch. Yeah, they just watch. That's cool. That's not weird at all. High-ranking nobles had the dubious honor of handing the king his shirt or chemise during these ceremonies. Some lucky courtiers got to see him naked, which apparently was a big deal. The king also had a ceremony for waking up called a lever, and one just for putting on his boots. Such rituals were the norm during the reign of 3 King Louis, the 14th, the 15th, and the 16th. It was such an important practice that one courtier wrote in 1784, "Most of the people who come to the court are persuaded that, to make their way there, they must show themselves everywhere, be absent as little as possible at the king's lever, removal of the boots, and coucher, show themselves assiduously at the dinners of the royal family, in short, must ceaselessly work at having themselves noticed." Basically, you were expected to be a spectator at every single moment of the king's day, no matter how trivial. Everyone likes to sit down now and again. Although we take it for granted today, it was an entirely different story in the French court of Versailles. Sitting down was a privilege for certain people in the court, and who could sit where was entirely based on rank. Kings and queens got their own armchairs, which were presumably quite fancy. princes and princesses, in the royal bloodline of course, had to make do with armless chairs. Duchesses were permitted to sit on stools. It's unclear whether the king and queen would then put their feet up on them, but we feel it's safe to say probably. Seating arrangements became a hot issue as more and more people schemed to sit on a stool in the same room as the king. And in some cases, French courtiers got a little crazy. In one famous incident, our good friend Princess d'Harcourt removed another duchess from her stool when she couldn't find a seat she liked otherwise. Boy, you do not want to cross that lady, especially if you didn't want to step in a puddle. For everyone else, seating was typically only available at mass, comedies, or card tables. And it offered little relief as they spent their entire day working on their feet. Kinda sounds like working retail. 17th century Paris was something of a fashion center for all of Europe. Although heeled shoes originated as horse riding gear, they originally became fashionable among royals. During the 17th century, heeled cavalier boots caught on, and people began wearing heeled shoes more often. Not wanting to be outdone by the lower classes, could you imagine? Nobles made their heels much higher to demonstrate their status and privilege. It took a little while for King Louis XIV to draw inspiration from his brother, Charles II, to start wearing opulent heels himself. He even had his favorite designer, Jean Bérain, include high heels in the special outfits he created for the Paris Opera. Louis loved heels, and both men and women began wearing the shoes as a fashion statement. Heels in Louis XIV's time were between 2 and 5 inches high, decorated with buckles, ribbons, and whatever opulent ornamentation the nobles desired. A coveted symbol of nobility, high heels became extremely popular among the court at Versailles. Specifically, red heels became the clear favorite, probably because red dye was expensive. Red heels looked good and were considered luxurious, making them a winner in the king's eyes. So naturally, he decreed only certain nobles could wear shoes like his. The ceremony for admission of privileges to the court was pretty complicated. Not only did nobles have to prove their degree of lineage, but they also faced strict rules for full court dress. Men had to have a unique, elegant suit for days 1 and 3. They had completely different outfits for hunting on day 2. But women had much more challenging requirements. They were required to wear a cumbersome 3-piece outfit. The skirts were heavy, long, and broader than 3 Ls, or approximately 3.6 meters, roughly the length of an adult Sasquatch. Women visiting the court were also required to wear uncomfortable and sometimes painful whalebone corsets. They were tight, with a wide oval neckline and short sleeves, and a long train that had to be carried along. You know, just in case anyone dared to try and relax. The outfits were so unwieldy that women had to practice wearing them. But the ceremony itself was a bit of a nightmare. Women had to curtsy multiple times as they approached the royals, then somehow back out of the room without turning their backs on them. Sounds like someone should have invented the moonwalk. If the pressure and skill of participating in the ceremony weren't enough, it was quite a financial burden to keep up with the nobles at Versailles. Elaborate ceremonies requiring equally elaborate outfits were just another way for the king to regulate the performance of the nobles and assert his influence over their lives. As you could probably tell by now, holding a high rank in Versailles came with special privileges. One of those privileges was the ability to receive guests from the comfort of your own bed. When parade beds became popular towards the end of the 17th century, nobles were more likely to receive visitors straight from their bedchambers. Nowadays, you just have to be unemployed to do that. Covered with intricate carvings, silk drapes, and some of the most ornate furnishings one could imagine, these beds were a sight to behold. They reeked of wealth and privilege, and probably a few other things too. Versailles sounds like it was a smelly place. But they served another vital purpose as a symbol of power. A parade bed was a significant status symbol, as it signified its owner was of extreme wealth and importance. And it's not hard to argue with the flex of not even getting out of bed to receive visitors. Royals did everything in front of courtiers. And if you've been paying attention to this video, you know we mean everything. And that includes eating. Food was a big deal in 17th and 18th century France. Nobles had master chefs working in their homes and crafting special cookbooks just for them. Gourmet meals reached a peak during Louis XV's time, and although the king usually ate his meals alone, that didn't prevent the court from holding multiple dinner ceremonies at Versailles. These opulent ceremonies could involve over 300 people, which sounds more like a tent at Oktoberfest than a dinner at the palace. Other times, the king dined with his family during a tradition called the Grand Couvert, during which nobles had to sit on stools and watch the royals eat sardines, salmon, and other delicacies fit for a king. Visitors to the palace also had an opportunity to view the gastronomical proceedings. And there were some pretty famous visitors, too. The court once invited a young Mozart to stand beside the royal table, and even Voltaire dined at Versailles. Hopefully, they gave those guys chairs. But they probably didn't. The self-indulgent excess of life at Versailles continued right up to 1789, when Louis XVI moved the seat of French power back to Paris during a little conflict known as the French Revolution. Versailles sat abandoned for the next several decades, and Louis XV's former subjects stuck him in the guillotine. And this time, he didn't have to force anyone to watch. Marie Antoinette has been the portrait of decadence and extravagance for almost 250 years. Her unpopularity, fueled in large part by her lavish lifestyle, made her a polarizing figure, so much so that it eventually led to her death. As it turns out, much of the hate for the infamous French queen was based on lies and rumors. And unlike what you saw in the Sofia Coppola movie, she probably did not listen to The Cure. So, today we're debunking well-known facts about Marie Antoinette that just aren't true. Let's review the royal research. The name Marie Antoinette conjures up lifestyles of the rich, the famous, the spoiled, the selfish, the absolutely gigantic hair. And it doesn't help her case to relay the most famous tale surrounding her. Picture Marie Antoinette standing on her balcony, declaring to the hungry people who wanted bread, "Let them eat cake." History's equivalent of asking how much a banana could possibly cost. That shocking disregard for her fellow man ended up becoming the phrase most attributed to the wife of King Louis XVI and Queen of France in the 18th century. But before you get all, "let them eat the rich," not only did Marie Antoinette never say such a thing, but the actual quote had been around long before she even sat on the throne. The quote, "let them eat cake," had been written in print since Marie was only 10 years old, with the concept of the phrase going as far back as 1660. This similar phrase was apparently first uttered by Louis XIV's queen, Marie Therese, not Antoinette. But as far as we know, Kirsten Dunst didn't star in any movies about Marie Therese, unless we're missing some allegory about Bring It On. For nearly 2 centuries, the Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of France were the bitterest of rivals. Think Red Sox versus Yankees, but with slightly more bloodshed. Just slightly. When the diplomatic revolution occurred in 1756, the two sides agreed to end hostilities and be friends again. At this time, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI would have been around 10 years old, but still found themselves at the center of this new alliance. As part of the treaty, Marie was betrothed to Louis, destined to one day become his bride. As you can imagine, for the folks who remember just how bitter the Franco-Austrian rivalry had been, the idea of an outsider queen did not sit well with most people. If Derek Jeter suddenly married David Ortiz, your average Bostoner would not welcome Jeter with open arms right away, you know? You can't mention Marie Antoinette without picturing a pampered, hedonistic queen with little regard for those around her, unless they happen to be serving her grapes or something. As it turns out, those images are highly out of character for the queen. In fact, Marie Antoinette was an intelligent and distinctly charitable woman who displayed strong sensitivity toward the poor population in France, despite her own lavish lifestyle. She has been described as so happy at doing good and hated any missed opportunity to be helpful. It is true that this is the same queen who insensitively dressed as a milkmaid to tend to heavily perfumed goats, so she was undeniably out of touch. But it didn't mean she wasn't capable of doing some actual good. Plus, those goats must have smelled divine. Speaking of the queen's image, no one is debating whether Marie Antoinette had a penchant for partying. She liked the finer things in life and had the expensive tastes you would expect of the Queen of France. She partied. Big time. However, if you were told that her lavish lifestyle single-handedly took down the French economy, allow us to balance the books for you. For this fib, you could place most of the blame on America. France was heavily involved in the American Revolution. The troops and supplies France provided to the Union helped the U.S. win the war and in so defeat France's archenemy, England. But France's involvement caused them a significant amount of debt. And those who owned the most property in France, such as churches or nobility, were exempt from taxes. That means the brunt of the financial burden fell on the poor. So when your country loses all its money and you have to pick up the bill, it's easier to blame the queen covered in diamonds rather than fiduciary irresponsibility and funding a war. Back when Marie Antoinette was on top, the expectation was that a man was in charge. But Louis XVI was, for lack of a nicer word, a weak monarch, incapable of making decisions or leading on his own. A nonarch, if you will. Lucky for him, his wife was an intelligent go-getter who was all too happy to step in and call the shots. Described at a young age as a bit of a tomboy, Marie had no qualms showing off her more aggressive traits, one of which was to counsel government in her husband's stead. She probably also threw a wicked heater during royal baseball games. Toward the end of their reign, and therefore the end of their lives, it was Marie who held counsel with ministers and ambassadors. It was Marie who watched over their undertakings and revised their dispatches. And it was Marie who decreed that every Tuesday would be Taco Tuesday. Oh, well, maybe not the last one, though that probably would have helped her approval rating. Women in 18th century France were viewed by some as little more than people factories, so the importance of fertility could not be overstated. Back then, if you didn't bear children for 7 years, that was a huge problem, and it was almost always considered a lady problem. So when Marie Antoinette could not conceive for close to a decade, the people pointed the finger at her. Although there's no telling what caused their dry spell, historians believe that Louis suffered from phimosis, a handicap which made sexual intercourse painful. He eventually had surgery to correct the problem, but not before the typhoon of blame had made landfall at Marie's feet. There's one thing a celebrity has in short supply, it's privacy. And for Marie Antoinette, all her riches and fortune paled in comparison to some good old-fashioned alone time. Before she was queen, her imperial family at the Austrian court lived their lives in a relaxed and domestic way, like most imperial family units do today. However, privacy wasn't really a thing in French court. Royalty was expected to be available and on display to the public that supported them all day, every day. So when Marie arrived in France, she shrugged off court etiquette almost immediately. As soon as the 18-year-old bride married the king, he gifted Marie her own hideaway where she could escape the struggles of royalty. The clubhouse, known as the Pleasure House, was very exclusive, limited only to Marie's closest friends. This caused the rest of the French court to feel snubbed by the queen. And so, like a bunch of mean girls, they started to spread rumors about the hideaway. The presence of spicy gossip and salacious cartoons only fueled the flames of resentment from the lower class, who struggled while it appeared to them Marie was apparently living in a hedonistic paradise. As far as celebrity scandals go, the affair of the necklace would have been a tabloid goldmine. And while Marie Antoinette took most of the flack for the scandal, she wasn't even involved. In 1785, a Catholic cardinal named Louis de Rohan thought he was corresponding with the Queen in order to purchase an expensive diamond necklace. De Rohan had been on Marie's blacklist ever since he insulted her mother. Ouch. So he was keen on getting back in her graces. But here's the rub. De Rohan was an early victim of catfishing. He hadn't been corresponding with the Queen at all. In reality, he was trading letters with a woman named Jeanne de la Motte. She convinced de Rohan not only that she was the queen, but that she was excited to purchase the necklace she had previously poo-pooed for being too expensive. The grift even went as far as an in-person meeting, using a woman who looked enough like Marie to trick the cardinal. In the end, the necklace went missing, and the cardinal accused Marie Antoinette of stiffing him on the bill. Motte was eventually found out and sentenced to jail, but not before word spread that Marie was the kind of queen who doesn't pay up. Her already fragile reputation ended up in tatters, and nobody even got a necklace out of it. Wait, I guess somebody did. Despite being despised by so many, Marie Antoinette was known for keeping her cool. Incredibly poised after her arrest and imprisonment, Marie wrote about how her time in the big house had actually made her stronger, not weaker. When the day of her execution came, she didn't fight or yell. Instead, she wrote that since her conscience was clear, she felt a certain sense of calm. Marie was also devoted to her family up until the bitter end. When given the choice between freedom or remaining in prison, she chose the latter in order to be with her family. And when campaigning for her family's release, it was Marie who spent the time incessantly writing copious amounts of letters. Not her husband, King Louis. Man, did that guy do anything? After a grueling 32-hour trial spanning the course of 2 days, Marie Antoinette was found unanimously guilty and sentenced to the guillotine. But throughout it all, the former queen remained one cool cucumber. Since her execution at the end of the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette has become the personification of offensive royal extravagance and righteous class conflict. Now, imagine if that was your mom. Marie's children would grow up under a microscope at the lavish palace at Versailles, where, like their mother, their lives were controlled by protocol and social duty. But when the French Revolution came, everything was turned upside down. Today, we're going to take a look at what life was like for Marie Antoinette's children. D'accord, découvrons les enfants de Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was born November 2, 1755, in Vienna, which was, at the time, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. She was the 11th daughter of Emperor Francis I and Empress Maria Theresa, and on May 16, 1770, at the age of 14, she was married to King Louis XVI of France. The very next morning, rumors began to swirl that the royal couple had not consummated the marriage. It must have been trending on pre-revolutionary French Twitter. As it turned out, the rumors were true, and in fact, Marie remained a virgin for 7 more years. It's unknown why the couple waited so long to, go Frenching, but historians suspect a physical or psychological issue with Louis. Alas, in 1778, Marie gave birth to a daughter who was named Marie Therese. It is said that during the birth, no less than 200 people crowded into her bedchamber to watch the labor. However, the long wait between the wedding and the birth of the royal couple's first child didn't sit well with the public, who, in all fairness, already hated Marie. They questioned if she was really queen material. In 1781, Marie gave birth to her second child. This time it was a son who she named Louis Joseph. As a male, Louis Joseph became the heir to the throne, the Dauphin, and Marie doted on him, as she did with her daughter. Royal protocol greatly restricted Marie's ability to personally give her children day-to-day care, so she got in the habit of taking them away from the court to her private retreat, which was known as Petit Trianon. The small palace, which was situated on the grounds at Versailles, was a present to Marie from her husband, and it was the perfect place to escape the pressures of royal life. As mentioned previously, the foreign-born Marie Antoinette was never cool with the French people. Even before the Revolution, she had enemies, and when it suited their purposes, they gleefully attacked her relationship with her children. Marie was known as a devoted mother, but when it came to being a wife, she had a reputation for her infidelities. In fact, in the 1780s, Marie did have an affair with a Swedish diplomat named Axel von Fersen, who had fought in the American Revolution. When her third child, Louis Charles, was born in 1785, rumor had it that von Fersen, rather than King Louis, was the child's father. The rumor and image of their king as a cuckold didn't do much to improve Marie's standing among the people. Barely a year after giving birth to Louis Charles, on July 9, 1786, Marie Antoinette gave birth to her fourth and final child. It was a daughter, and they named her Sophie Beatrix. Sadly, Sophie, who had been born prematurely, would die before her first birthday. The couple was devastated. It was the first time they had lost a child, but it wouldn't be the last. Just 2 years later, in the summer of 1789, 7-year-old Louis Joseph, the Dauphin himself, died of an illness. Louis was heir to the throne, but he had also been sickly his whole life. Historians believe his cause of death may have been tuberculosis of the spine, but whatever the case, Marie wouldn't have much time to mourn her son. Only a few weeks after Louis's passing, the French Revolution began. The royal family remained in Paris for the early days of the revolution, but things got uncomfortable fast. The revolutionaries were increasingly questioning the monarchy, and it was pretty obvious which way the political winds were blowing. The royal family very wisely decided to flee the country. In June of 1791, Louis and Marie disguised themselves and headed for Belgium, which was controlled by Marie's Habsburg family. They nearly made it, but the king was recognized in Varennes, and the family was captured and taken into custody. They would never return to their palace. Instead, the Revolutionary Assembly decided to send the entire royal family, including the young children, to a medieval fortress where jailers could easily watch over them. Louis Charles was born in 1785, and he spent the early years of his life running and playing in the gilded halls of Versailles. He was 4 when the Revolution came, and it changed everything for him. Upon the death of his brother, Louis Joseph, Louis Charles had become the new Dauphin. You would think becoming heir to the throne of a major world power would be a good thing, but with the advent of the Revolution, not so much. Louis Charles was branded the son of a tyrant and locked away in a tower. He spent 4 years living in solitary confinement. Separated from his family, Louis Charles' jailers were able to mistreat him, and they even forced him to testify against his own mother. It was at Marie's trial where the state had Louis say that his mother had molested him. Marie vehemently denied the charge, but it didn't matter. The deck was stacked against her. Marie was convicted and then executed by guillotine on October 16, 1793. Louis was not informed of his mother's death. Instead, he was beaten and thrown in a cell infested with fleas and filled with human waste. Left to rot, Louis Charles slowly lost his mind. The revolutionaries locked Marie Therese, the eldest royal child, in a tower from 1792 to 1795. The teenager was allowed 2 books, which she read over and over again. Her cell was very close to where her brother Louis Charles was held. The siblings were allowed no contact during the course of their imprisonment, but Marie Therese was able to hear her brother crying when his jailers would beat him. Way to keep it classy, France. Over the course of her imprisonment, Marie Therese's relatives were executed one by one. First her mother, then her aunt, and then her brother. But Marie herself knew nothing about it, as her jailers carefully hid the news from her. Finally, in December of 1795, the Reign of Terror ended. Marie Therese, now the only surviving member of her family, was released and allowed to go to Austria, where she would live with her mother's family. Marie Antoinette's trial commenced in 1793. Perhaps sensing that the outcome was a foregone conclusion, she responded to the indictment against her by saying, "I was a queen, and you took away my crown, a wife, and you killed my husband, a mother, and you deprived me of my children. My blood alone remains. Take it, but do not make me suffer long." In her last days, Marie thought constantly about her son, Louis Charles. Just knowing that he was imprisoned distressed her, and making the situation more painful was the fact that she was allowed no contact with him. Louis, for his part, didn't even know his mother was on trial. Shortly before she met her fate, Marie wrote to her sister-in-law and expressed grief and bitterness at being forced to leave her children behind. The doomed queen told her beloved relative, "You know that I existed but for them and you." Louis Charles died in June of 1795 at the age of 10. His cause of death is suspected to be tuberculosis brought on by his imprisonment. A doctor who examined the boy's body was able to smuggle out his heart. Eventually, it would be buried next to the graves of his parents. Louis Charles was only 8 when he became an orphan, and had the monarchy survived, he would have become King Louis XVII. From the public's perspective, though, the boy just vanished behind bars during the Revolution and was never seen again. Even his burial was conducted in secret. These circumstances, unfortunately, created the perfect opportunity for con men looking to impersonate the king, and plenty tried. Over 100 different impostors claimed to be Louis Charles, the true heir of the throne of France. Charles Guillaume Nandorf was one of them. Charles spent time in a German prison for counterfeiting before revealing that he was the Dauphin. He even wrote to poor Marie Therese asking her to meet with him to help prove he was really her brother. Even Baron von Thuget, a respected Austrian diplomat of the era, argued that there is no real and legal certainty that the son of Louis XVI is dead. He pointed out that there was no real proof of the death, only an announcement in the newspaper, and a report drawn up by revolutionaries who were presented with the body of a dead child they were told was Louis. He wasn't wrong. The proof of Louis's death was less than compelling. Sadly, that uncertainty would torment Marie Therese for the rest of her life. Marie Therese was the only one of Marie Antoinette's 4 children to survive the French Revolution. In 1799, she would marry her cousin, Louis Antoine, who claimed to be the next in line for the throne. In 1830, she would finally follow in her mother's footsteps and become Queen of France. Her reign, however, lasted about 20 minutes. After less than half an hour, her husband abdicated in favor of his nephew. Not surprisingly, spending years behind bars hearing jailers wallop her kid brother, only to be released and learn that her entire family had been killed, had taken its toll on Marie. She never recovered. Though she did return to live in France, she was forced to flee the country several more times, and she was tormented by impostors claiming to be Louis for the rest of her life. Marie Therese finally passed away in 1851, at the age of 72. It's Versailles, 1682. You're King Louis XIV, and you fall in love with a little piece of land where a beautiful chateau is tucked away in the lush suburban forests of France. What starts out as a cozy hunting chateau becomes an all-inclusive city unto itself. From the outside looking in, Versailles seemed like Xanadu, but in reality, the living conditions were far from perfect. Today, we're going to find out what it was really like to live in the Palace of Versailles. Let's voyage to this malice at the palace. Life at Versailles was a highly ritualized existence. Even the simple act of the king and queen getting dressed in the morning was a spectacle. During the lever, also known as an official awakening, high-ranking courtiers and royal family members had specific morning tasks, such as handing the king his clothes or holding a mirror. The king and queen also had an evening crew that did the process in reverse at the coucher, also known as the going-to-bed ceremony. About 100 people crowded into the royal bedchambers to witness these ceremonies, every day and every night. According to one courtier, nobles should be absent as little as possible at the king's lever, as well as at his bedtime ritual to better assert their presence at court. Louis XIV had strong aesthetics. Not only did he want his palace and its grounds to look perfect, he wanted the people he populated it with to dress with the same level of detail. Louis XIV required palace courtiers to wear certain clothes for specific days or occasions. For example, at dinner, men had to wear their hats at the table, and because the clothes of courtiers were so tight and elaborate, the meal was usually an uncomfortable affair. Louis XIV also tied fashion to French identity by supporting French textile industries. He was so committed to supporting French craftsmen that he once burned his son's clothes because they weren't made of French cloth. Millions of photos, videos, and paintings have been taken of the Palace of Versailles, but one thing no image has ever been able to capture: its stench. Plainly put, the palace smelled like feces, human feces. The thing is, plumbing wasn't really a thing at Versailles. The king had his own fancy facilities, but the vast majority of nobles didn't have anything. All they had were chamber pots. The lack of hygienic areas to relieve full bladders or bowels meant courtiers did their business anywhere and everywhere, including the palace hallways. Yes, the palace literally smelled like shit, but people who lived there adapted by dousing themselves with perfume to mask the smell. At Versailles, Louis XIV basically transformed the nobility into a class of servants. He bestowed his mark of royal favor by inviting specific high-ranking courtiers and members of the royal family to perform certain tasks, like brushing his hair or holding a candle. Tasks were highly regimented, and no two individuals could perform the same job. King Louis XIV loved pets, especially dogs. He even owned several Great Pyrenees, which were bred in Spain. The palace dogs had an allowance of 1,446 livres a year, roughly $20,000 by modern standards, and royal bakers made treats for them every day. The king loved animals so much, he even established a royal menagerie at Versailles. The menagerie housed a wide variety of animals ranging from elephants to flamingos. But royal pets weren't the only animals at Versailles. It was common for courtiers to see animals, both feral and domesticated, just walking around the palace and its gardens like it was no big deal. You could see lions, tigers, hyenas, and bears. Oh my. That said, house cats were not welcomed at the palace. Sorry, cat people. As we mentioned, people didn't just visit the Palace of Versailles. A lot of people lived there. After all, the entire operation needed an entire service industry, and those people, roughly 10,000 nobles, government officials, and servants, all lived on the grounds. So it's no surprise that living quarters for all 10,000 of those people were at a premium. Of course, there was a pecking order in regards to which courtiers got the best rooms. Higher-ranking courtiers tended to have better rooms than lower-ranking ones. You also knew where you fell in rank by how close your quarters were to the king. The closer you were to the king's room, the tighter you were with his entourage. There was also a chance to get a bump to a room closer to the king, but it required a lot of politicking. Because the opportunity to serve the king was a coveted privilege, courtiers were always trying to climb socially in order to get better jobs. Before we move forward, it should be known that these better jobs were some of the most demeaning jobs ever. For example, doing something as mundane and relatively base as getting the king's chamber pot was considered a high honor. These were entry-level servant jobs, but if you got to be the king's piss boy, you were doing well for yourself. So with all that said, jockeying for these different jobs was a game of shady politics. Some jobs could be bought, while others were bestowed to courtiers who had entered the king or queen's good graces. Louis XIV had a good idea when he filled his courtiers' days at Versailles with daily tornadoes filled with pointless ceremonies, unnecessary rituals, and frivolous entertainment. His thinking was that if his higher-ranking courtiers' days were filled with busy work, they couldn't A. leave Versailles without the king's permission, or B. plot his demise. So courtiers spent their time doing things like attending parties or watching the king do things as mundane as eat or bathe. As fancy and proper as the palace seemed, there wasn't a whole lot of exclusion in regards to outsiders. Versailles grounds were actually open to nearby communities. It was common for tourists to stop by Versailles, and guards allowed their admittance to the palace on the condition they follow correct etiquette. Unfortunately, local peasants and area drifters took advantage of their proximity to Versailles by frequently disposing of their trash on the perimeter of the palace's grounds. Still, with thousands of courtiers schlepping around their filled chamber pots all over the palace, a little extra filth from the locals was easy to overlook. As a result of the king's open-door policy, the palace's population swelled with the number of visitors on any given day. Imagining the stench, no wonder the French's perfume industry advanced so rapidly. Because courtiers were present during every waking moment during the royal family's existence, they were eyewitnesses to some fairly intimate moments. We've already talked far too much about the king's fecal rituals, but let's not forget other moments of royal vulnerability, like giving birth. Furthering the line of succession was a matter of political consequence, so when a new prince or princess was about to arrive, the queen's labor became a grand spectacle. Courtiers got first-row seats to royal births, often jostling and elbowing each other for glimpses of the scene. Their gawking served a purpose. Courtiers were supposed to vouch for the new baby and affirm it hadn't been switched at birth. King Louis XIV also made his courtiers watch him and the queen eat. Mind you, these weren't special dinners or meals of significance. Louis just wanted an audience. In Versailles, virtually every aspect of Louis XIV was on view. The Grand Couvert was the dinner ceremony where the king and his family publicly took their meal in front of an audience. The opulent meal was usually meat-heavy and included such sides as pigeons, partridges, even truffled chickens. Courtiers and visitors who witnessed the ritual had to stand for the entire meal. Again, if the courtiers were too busy watching the king stuff roasted pigeon in his maw, they'd be too busy to overthrow his rule. Like most resorts, the Palace of Versailles was lovely when the weather was agreeable. During the sunnier season, its green, lush gardens, although offset by the smell of human waste and locals' trash, were majestic. But winters were rough. Winters mean courtiers were left freezing in their poorly insulated living quarters. The thing is, the palace was so large, fireplaces didn't heat rooms well. One visitor recalled in 1695, "It is so cold here that at the king's table, wine as well as water froze in the glasses." You think the Gatsbys threw great parties? Those shindigs were nothing compared to King Louis's bashes. Louis threw parties all the time, sometimes daily. As a matter of fact, one of the first large-scale entertainments at Versailles was the Delights of the Enchanted Island, a 6-day rager staged to celebrate the beginning of the building campaign for the Château de Versailles. The intention of this week-long party was to acquaint those involved, such as Louis's wife, his mother, his side pieces, his mistresses, and anyone else in his family, with the construction of the chateau. It was kind of like a let's meet the neighbors soiree to get things off on the right foot. With competitive races, lavish banquets, and theatricals by the popular playwright Molière, where he premiered La Princesse d'Alide and Tartuffe. In short, the Delights of the Enchanted Island party of 1664 was basically the Kentucky Derby, Thanksgiving dinner, and a Broadway performance all rolled into one giant party. The king was a baller. When previously exiled Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France in 1815, he was fixated on returning to power. Napoleon was a top-notch military commander who brought somewhere in the neighborhood of 72,000 troops to the Battle of Waterloo. Despite this, the little dictator was soundly defeated by the smaller force led by the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon blamed his defeat on his generals in poor health, but historians aren't so sure. Today, we're going to take a look at why Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. Emerging from the French Revolution as a military hero, Napoleon Bonaparte was able to take control of France in the late 18th century. He embarked on military campaigns throughout Europe and arranged for himself to become consul for life in 1802. Finally, in 1804, he stopped being coy and went all the way, declaring himself emperor. By 1812, Napoleon had started wars with almost every country on the continent and was attempting to conquer lands all the way from Britain to Russia. A failed invasion of the latter eventually led to his defeat when a coalition of Prussian, Austrian, Swedish, and Russian troops took Paris in 1814. Forced to abdicate, Napoleon was exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba as a condition of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. According to the writer William Krakenthorpe, which is a pretty awesome name, who met with Napoleon during this first exile, most of the emperor's time on Elba was spent thinking about and planning his escape. France had become a constitutional monarchy and placed the weak and increasingly unpopular Louis XVIII on the throne. Napoleon, who still had his eye on seizing power, thought the time was coming to make his move. Napoleon kept in constant contact with his associates in France, which was a relatively short distance away. He was allowed many visitors, which helped him plot quite extensively, even while being monitored by the British. Finally, on February 26, 1815, after 10 months of exile, Napoleon left Elba with a handful of soldiers. They easily eluded the British Navy and quickly made it back to the mainland. Of his decision to return from exile, Napoleon said, "After making a mistake or suffering a misfortune, the man of genius always gets back on his feet." Or to paraphrase Chumbawamba, he got knocked down, but he got up again. Once back in France, Napoleon gathered troops on his way to Paris. 6 days after his arrival, he was confronted by an infantry unit that had been sent for the express purpose of stopping his advance. Napoleon faced the soldiers alone and offered the chance to kill him to anyone who would take it. The soldiers instead broke into a cheer of, "Way, way! Long live the Emperor! Long live the Emperor!" From that point on, the army was with him. Within 2 weeks, Napoleon arrived in the capital and the king fled. Realizing they had only one chance to nip this thing in the bud, Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, who were at each other's throats deciding how to rebuild post-war Europe, quickly reunited. They declared Napoleon an outlaw and vowed to stop him again. On June 16, 1815, Napoleon's forces squared off with Prussian troops, led by Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher at Ligny, Belgium. Napoleon won the battle. However, the Prussian troops made a fast tactical retreat, and the French were unable to completely wipe them out. After the Battle of Ligny, 30,000 men, led by French General Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy, went after the Prussians. Meanwhile, Napoleon marched his troops toward English forces gathering at a place called Waterloo. The soldiers that Grouchy had taken to chase down the Prussian army constituted roughly a full third of Napoleon's forces. After the significance of the battle became clear, Napoleon would send a dispatch to Grouchy ordering him to bring his troops to Waterloo. Grouchy received the dispatch, but he ignored it. Instead, Grouchy opted to follow the initial orders given to him by Napoleon. Napoleon would later blame Grouchy for the loss at Waterloo. He believed the marshal had intentionally withheld the troops, saying,
I would have won that battle without the imbecility of Grouchy.
In truth, Grouchy's decision didn't make much of a difference. Napoleon's dispatch didn't arrive until late afternoon, and there was no direct path to Waterloo from Grouchy's location near Wavre. In other words, there was no way he could have made it in time to change the outcome. In all fairness to Napoleon, though, he did order Grouchy to pursue Blücher, who was at Waterloo. The following night, it poured rain. The coalition of British, Belgian, German, and Dutch troops that had come to fight the French slept beneath a heavy and incessant torrent of rain. It was still coming down on the morning of June 18th, and the ground was muddy. There were brief lulls in the inclement weather, and both sides used them to prep for battle. Neither side, though, made a move. Napoleon spent the morning assessing the terrain. He knew the wet conditions around Waterloo would make combat extra difficult, and while he wanted to start the battle as early as 9 a.m., he wound up having to wait until 11 to launch his first attack. It was a reasonable tactical call, but the delay would cost him dearly. Little did Napoleon know, but the Prussian troops, commanded by Gebhard Lieberecht von Blücher, were on their way to Waterloo. The 30,000-odd troops intended to join with the British forces of Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, and the battle's late start gave them plenty of time to get there. During the battle, Napoleon kept his Imperial Guard in reserve. They were finally deployed sometime after 7 p.m. in a desperate bid to salvage the fight. Napoleon was reportedly somber and very pale when he made the decision. Sending his own guards into combat was a desperate move that put his very life at risk. Nonetheless, he sent them in. It is generally agreed that they were dispatched to the center of the British lines in 2 columns, although there are those who have suggested the Guard moved in square formations. Napoleon ordered his men to advance in a column toward a strategically important farmhouse compound called La Haie Sainte. His battalions lined up one after another, leaving little space between them. The columns were meant to be wider than they were long, but it didn't go down like that. The columns, in the words of one contemporary commentator, became too extended to conduct any meaningful maneuver, and impossible to deploy without much trial and error into a good formation against cavalry. In the early afternoon, Napoleon dispatched infantry to the core of the British forces at La Haie Sainte. Led by Général de Division Comte Jean-Baptiste Drouet d'Erlon, the attack had the support of roughly 80 cannons. At first, the strike was quite successful, but they were soon confronted by British infantry troops led by Thomas Picton. Picton's men completely stopped the advance of d'Erlon's troops, and Wellington's cavalry was able to swoop in and drive them back. An entire brigade of the 2nd French Division was almost completely annihilated in the exchange. According to the recollections of British cavalryman John Dickinson, Wellington's forces sabred many of the enemy gunners. Dickinson recalled hearing the Frenchmen yet crying, "Diable," when I struck at them, and the long-drawn hiss through their teeth as my sword went home. British commander Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, lined up the bulk of his forces along a plateau at Mont-Saint-Jean. Additional troops were placed nearby at Papelotte, La Haie Sainte, and Hougoumont farms. Napoleon knew the high ground was a formidable advantage. Intent on drawing Wellington's men away from their position, he sent a group to attack Hougoumont farms. This diversionary attack was led by Napoleon's own brother, Jérôme, along with General Honoré Riel. Unfortunately for them, the British forces at Hougoumont were able to withstand the French incursion. After the French broke the gate to get in, the British even closed it behind them, trapping the Frenchmen inside. The British then proceeded to slaughter the French troops. According to eyewitness Matthew Clay, the gates were clogged with the bodies of French soldiers who were scarcely distinguishable because they had been very much trodden upon and covered in mud. Despite the failure, Napoleon kept trying to take Hougoumont throughout the day. Ultimately, he sent somewhere between 13 and 15,000 French troops to try and take the farm. Marshal Michel Ney, Duke of Elchingen, Prince of Moscova, was nicknamed Red Lion on account of his red hair. He was also one of Napoleon's most formidable generals, with a long history of success in the field. Commissioned as an officer in 1792, Ney went on to become Marshal of the Empire in 1804 and served with valor in the failed 1812 attack on Moscow. However, by 1815, Ney was fatigued and by many accounts had lost much of his military acumen. At Waterloo, Ney was placed in charge of the left wing of Napoleon's army, and things didn't go so well. Late in the battle, he ordered several cavalry strikes against the British, but without infantry support, they were pointless. In the face of defeat, Ney is reported to have hoped for his own death. He even told his men to
Come and see. Our Marshal of France can die.
which was probably not the most reassuring thing they could hear at that point. The task of retaking the village of Plancenoit from the French fell on Prussian reinforcements, led by General Friedrich Wilhelm Freiherr von Bülow. Once his 32,000 troops arrived at Waterloo, they attacked and retook Plancenoit in the early evening. According to one historian, this left Napoleon outflanked and threatened his line of retreat. Napoleon was left with little choice but to send in a division of reinforcements and try to take the village back. He was successful, but the victory was only temporary. Control over Plancenoit shifted back and forth throughout the fight, and in the end, Prussia won. Ultimately, Napoleon would be defeated at Waterloo and exiled to a remote island in the South Atlantic. He was stripped of his imperial title, and he lost all ties to his formerly regal life. Napoleon died in exile on St. Helena on May 5, 1821. The official cause of death was stomach cancer. King Louis XIV of France moved his royal court to Versailles in 1682. Though it had originally been a hunting lodge, Louis expanded and remodeled Versailles so that it became a glittering palace, worthy of his status as the Sun King. French aristocrats were expected to live there as well. But for the people who were actually there, it was most memorable for something considerably less opulent: the stench. So, today we're going to take a look at what hygiene was like at the court of Versailles. Contrary to how most people view it today, folks in the 17th century didn't see hot water baths as a pleasurable indulgence or a hygienic necessity. In fact, many of them believed that bathing in hot water was actually bad for one's health. According to historian Jules Harper, the common belief was that warm water weakened the body and widened the pores, thus allowing diseases to enter. People everywhere, not just in France, found it much safer and better for the health to have a quick wash than soaking in a tub. King Louis himself was no exception. In fact, historians believe the so-called Sun King had only 2 baths over the course of his entire life.
Très nasty.
Now, that's not to say he never attended to his personal hygiene. He is known to have occasionally wiped himself down with a towel, scrubbed his body with perfume and alcohol, and washed his hands every morning. But sitting next to him at a dinner wouldn't be too easy on the olfactory sense. Now, as we established, Louis XIV wasn't too into bathing or showering, so when he got sweaty, he, like your old college roommate, would simply change his shirt. Louis and his courtiers changed shirts multiple times per day, a move that signaled both their money and status. However, though perfumes allowed users to mask unpleasant smells, body odor was still a major problem. Sadly for all involved, underarm deodorants wouldn't be widely used until the 20th century. In modern times, answering nature's call is typically a pretty private experience, but that wasn't always the case at Versailles. Louis XIV, for example, often took meetings with visitors while on the commode, as did other members of his court. Kind of gives a whole new meaning to doing your business. Despite this unnecessary openness, all inhabitants would have also had chamber pots or commodes in their private rooms. The higher ranking you were at court, the more likely you would have been to have a small closet in your chambers in which to do your business. For those of you wondering, the first flush toilet didn't arrive at Versailles until Louis XV, the Sun King's immediate successor, had one installed for his personal use in 1738. Though inhabitants had commodes and chamber pots in their private living spaces, Versailles had public-use latrines. But considering the sheer number of people on the estate, the supply was, to say the least, woefully inadequate. The combination of minimal toilets and high demand meant the latrines were under a tremendous strain. They often overflowed, and sewage seeped through the walls and floors into neighboring rooms. Versailles had limited plumbing, which meant that chamber pots were unceremoniously dumped out the windows. Passerbys would have to move with caution. And as we covered in our video on hygiene during the French Revolution, even Marie Antoinette was said to have once been hit by flying waste. Sacre Dieu! If the pots weren't dumped out the window, they would have to be transported to one of the nearby cesspools that collected waste. Given the lack of adequate plumbing and the density of people at the palace, many courtiers answered nature's call whenever and wherever it was most convenient. Seeing someone in the act of relieving him or herself wasn't an uncommon sight. The Princesse d'Harcourt, for one, didn't think twice about urinating in public. In 1702, German-born Princess Elizabeth Charlotte recoiled at the behavior she saw at the French court. In her words, "The people stationed in the galleries in front of our rooms piss in all the corners. It is impossible to leave one's apartment without seeing someone peeing." Louis XIV finally made a point of directing servants to clean up the waste weekly. By all accounts, the stench of Versailles was horrendous and overpowering. According to one eyewitness, the unpleasant odors in the park, gardens, even the chateau, could make a person literally gag. The hallways, courtyards, and corridors were full of urine and feces, and the Avenue Saint-Cloud was covered with stagnant water and dead cats. So what did the courtiers do to counteract the stomach-churning smells that filled the air? They attempted to cover it up. Yes, most of the residents routinely doused themselves with generous quantities of perfume. As historian Alan Corbin put it, to use excessive amounts of perfume was to protect oneself and to purify the surrounding air. But it was ultimately counterproductive. The prevalence of perfumes only made things worse, since it added yet another fragrance to the already unbearable stench. Versailles was also a hotbed of liaisons amongst all classes. After Louis XIV moved his court to the former hunting lodge, workers and nobles alike descended on the town. According to people who were there at the time, the forest surrounding the palace grounds became a kind of open-air brothel, since sex workers could be solicited there. In light of what he deemed to be the immoral licentiousness of his court and kingdom, Louis vigorously policed sex workers and marked them as sinners. However, contrary to Louis's public stances on morality, he maintained numerous mistresses. A political leader saying one thing and doing the opposite? That's hard to believe. After a lifetime of dental problems, Louis XIV was toothless by the time he passed in 1715. His dental woes were bad, but they were far from unique. Decadent treats made with refined sugar began to be widely available in France in the 17th century. French aristocrats, who were apparently indifferent to the effects of poor dental care, gobbled them up, and it typically led to rotted teeth. Despite, or perhaps because of, the prevalence of rotten teeth, having a good mouth was important to many courtiers at Versailles and their beauty ideals. As described in the 17th century text, The School of Venus, a beautiful woman should have even and very white teeth. Courtiers used various powders and mouthwashes to give the appearance of healthy teeth. Thanks in part to improvements in dentistry, oral hygiene had become a mark of elegance by the middle of the 18th century. In an alleged bid to conceal his own thinning hair, Louis XIV had been credited with helping popularize those fancy wigs they used to wear in France. But the wigs did more than just conceal male pattern baldness. They protected against lice. Well, sort of. See, the lice often infested them instead of a person's scalp, and boiling a lice-covered wig was way easier than picking lice out of a person's hair. That being said, men typically shaved their heads in order to wear wigs and control lice, while women, by and large, did not. The hygienic conditions at Versailles also impacted food. The plumbing problems, for example, made life difficult for the palace's cooks. For example, on at least one occasion, sewage seeped into Marie Antoinette's private kitchens and poisoned everything. Though hand-washing was part of Louis XIV's dining ritual, there is evidence that food was not always prepared or handled properly. As a result, intestinal parasites lived within courtiers at Versailles. Even the king wasn't spared, and it is known that he had several bouts of tapeworm. In fact, during one of those bouts, Louis is said to have relieved himself of a worm that was nearly 6 inches long. Despite how famous it is today, Versailles was never really an obvious location for a royal court. Initially built as a hunting lodge, it wasn't near flowing water, which could whisk away waste. Worse, the site was built on what one observer called shifting sand and marsh. So when Louis XIV decided to move his court there, the already poor hygienic situation at Versailles quickly deteriorated as more people descended on the space. Making matters worse exponentially was the fact that Louis generally stayed put at Versailles rather than circulating between multiple palaces, as kings had previously done. This put an impossible housekeeping burden on the army of servants and caretakers who simply couldn't keep up with the mountains of filth and waste that courtiers produced. Versailles was filthy, but a great place if you happened to be a cat person. In fact, any visitor to Versailles would have seen cats, both domestic and feral, throughout the palace estate. Some members of court brought their own pets, and the heaps of food of waste attracted rodents, which in turn attracted the cats that hunted them. Of course, the presence of so many cats led to even more sanitation problems. Feline droppings could be spotted all over the grounds. Worse, the remains of deceased cats could be found along the town's main thoroughfare. The reddish-purple-brown color known as puce got its name at Versailles, amusingly, thanks to a pest. It happened in 1775 when Marie Antoinette wore a gown in that color, prompting her husband Louis XVI to compare the color to une puce, or a flea. Despite the comparison, the color caught on. In fact, according to the Baroness d'Oberkirch, every lady at court wore a puce-colored gown: old puce, young puce, ventre de puce, dos de puce, etc. Puce wasn't the only color to get its name at Versailles. After the birth of Louis XVI's heir in 1781, courtiers marked the occasion by wearing a new color. They called it caca dauphin, or dauphin poop, because it was as brown as the infant's excrement. And you thought comparing the color of a dress to a flea was unflattering. After Louis XIV passed in 1715, his 5-year-old great-grandson inherited the throne as Louis XV. Recognizing the unhygienic and generally stinky state of the palace, Louis XV began several renovation projects aimed at cleaning things up a little. Chief among them was seeing to it that the sewage pipes were extended. This put a greater distance between the palace and its cesspools of human waste, which, if nothing else, had to be a good place to start. Paris is one of the world's most iconic and beautiful cities. It is a favorite tourist destination from around the world. But the romantic City of Lights also hides a dark secret: the city's underground catacombs, which are home to the skeletal remains of more than 6 million people. Not exactly the thing you want to hear before booking your flight. So, today on Weird History, we're exploring the creepy ossuaries beneath Paris and their unconventional history. Now, no reason to get catty, we're just talking catacombs. 200 miles of underground tunnels crammed full of human skeletons sounds like something out of medieval times. That's the sort of thing you build in an era called the Dark Ages. But in fact, these tunnels were first converted into final resting places for the city's dead in the late 18th century, in an attempt to rid the city of rapidly overflowing cemeteries. Before that, they had served as a network of mines and quarries, built during the Middle Ages to reach the rich limestone deposits beneath the city. These stones were then used to erect many of Paris's most famous and iconic buildings. Most of the mines were constructed by individuals without any kind of formal training or even permission, and many were never clearly mapped or identified, which made occasional cave-ins and collapses an ongoing problem. Due to the stable temperatures and humidity levels underground, from the 17th through the early 20th centuries, the mine shafts also housed several breweries. A number of extensions to the original cave network were even dug specifically for this purpose, allowing brewers to work underground and then easily transport their product to wait for customers above. This was not a one-off concept, but a thriving business. By the late 1800s, underground breweries in just the 14th arrondissement alone were producing more than 22 million gallons of beer each year. The longest-lasting and most famous of these brewers were known as Du Mesnil and remained in operation through the 1960s. The tunnels also once housed a number of mushroom farms. A specific type of button mushroom, the champignon de Paris, became specifically associated with the catacombs. The construction of the Paris metro in the early 1900s ultimately forced growers to move their operations elsewhere. In the mid-1700s, many of the city's largest grave sites, such as the Holy Innocents Cemetery along the Rue Saint-Denis, were becoming unsanitary due to the sheer number of corpses interred there, frequently in mass graves dating back centuries. Heavy rains and basement wall collapses in 1780 made Holy Innocents essentially unusable, not to mention a public health and safety hazard, demanding some urgent new solution. The underground mines, which were already being retrofitted and consolidated in order to deal with the frequent street and home collapses, seemed like the perfect place to cram all the extra bodies. By 1786, corpses were being exhumed nightly from cemeteries across the city and moved underground into the catacombs. Each night, covered wagons would remove bodies from nearby graves and deposit them in a mine shaft leading down into the tunnels, near the Rue de la Tombe Pissoire. The total process of clearing the city's most overcrowded burial sites and moving bodies into the catacombs took around 12 years. Even though the term catacombs technically only refers to the part that has all the dead bodies in it, it's now routinely used to refer to the entire network of mines and tunnels. Though it hadn't been their primary purpose, it wasn't long after the underground ossuaries were completed that it became clear the public would have some kind of dark interest in checking out these grim, subterranean hiding spots. Among the first ever visitors to the Paris catacombs was the future King Charles X, back when he was still known as the Count of Artois. In 1787, he actually organized a picnic down in the catacombs with some of his courtiers and friends. By 1809, the catacombs were occasionally opened up for individuals to explore, but only for important or prominent French citizens, and by appointment. At this point, they were still just a large, disorganized dumping ground for dead bodies that had been removed from Paris graveyards. Between 1810 and 1814, French politician and engineer Louis-Étienne Héricard de Thury decided to do something about it and began arranging the bones into patterns, murals, and collages. He specifically intended to honor the victims of the September massacres, incidents of public violence that occurred during the French Revolution. In all, Thury's designs incorporated around 1,200 skeletons out of a collection of several million. The list of important historical icons and royals who toured the site included German statesman Otto von Bismarck, Austria's Emperor Francis I, Sweden's Crown Prince Oscar, and Napoleon III. It wasn't until 1874 that a relatively small section of the tunnels were opened to the general public as a museum and tourist attraction. Tourists exploring the catacombs definitely want to stick with the well-traversed areas and large groups, as it's quite easy to get lost down there. In 1793, a porter from the Val-de-Grâce Hospital, named Philibert Asparot, entered the catacombs via a staircase in the hospital courtyard for reasons unknown, and was never heard from again. His decayed remains were discovered 11 years later in a quarry gallery very close to an exit. He'd nearly made it. He was interred on the spot where his body was found, with a small tombstone noting the peculiar circumstances of his death. That part of the catacombs, near the Boulevard Saint-Michel, isn't open to the public anymore. Sorry. Many visitors to the catacombs routinely wander down there on their own, as opposed to with a formal tour group. These renegade individuals, known as cataphiles, access the tunnel via former sewer holes and other secret entrances, and in some cases have left helpful navigation markers to guide one another around. Some of the tunnels actually have above-ground street names etched into the walls to prevent cataphiles and explorers from getting too turned around. Trespassers in blocked-off sections of the tunnels risk a $77 fine if they run into one of the police units that routinely patrol underground. National Geographic UK estimates the community could number in the hundreds of thousands. The relatively open, porous nature of catacomb access has led to a number of unexpected and surprising discoveries over the years. Several artists, for example, have used the tunnels as particularly dramatic impromptu galleries for their work. One anonymous street artist, going by the name of No Bad, was profiled by the New York Times in 2014. He's decorated a number of the walls with paintings that glow in the dark. In 2004, police undergoing training exercises in the catacombs discovered a working movie theater down there, beneath the city's famed Palais de Chaillot. In addition to a giant cinema screen and projection equipment, the cops found theater seats and a collection of classic films, not to mention a fully stocked bar and restaurant. Obviously, the theater had working electricity to run the projector, but it also had 3 active phone lines. Authorities returned to the site a few days later to investigate further, only to find that it had been completely taken apart and removed. The only remaining clue was a note reading, "Do not try and find us." Not all catacomb-themed events are quite so mysterious and obscure. The site has also hosted a number of unauthorized parties, raves, and events that attract widespread attention and numerous attendees, despite being technically illegal. Every Halloween, partygoers descend into the tunnels for a themed event known as Cataloween. Despite the ongoing popularity of these events, you're never still entirely safe wandering around unsupervised in a dark network of underground tunnels filled with skeletons. In 2011, 3 friends got lost in the catacombs while partying and drinking together, and were found only after 48 hours of searches. In 2016, a 45-year-old man suffered a fatal cardiac episode during a catacomb party. After descending a grand staircase into the catacombs themselves, visitors are first greeted by a small exhibition explaining their history and instructing anyone tall to watch out for occasional low ceilings. This anteroom is also filled with directional guides and other instructions that were etched onto the walls for the miners who once worked in the tunnels. The next room is known as the Porte-Maillon corridor and features a number of sculptures that were originally constructed in secret by a quarry worker named François Descure between 1777 and 1782. Descure would work on the project between shifts at the mine and during lunch breaks, using the same tools he was employing for his mining job, and lighting the room with torches for better visibility. The corridor is named after the Porte-Maillon fortress on the Spanish island of Majorca, which is depicted in one of Descure's designs. The artist was gravely injured during a cave-in while he was carving out a new stairway, which would have made his artwork more accessible from the street, and he never recovered. After exploring Descure's gallery, visitors then enter the ossuaries themselves, containing the skeletons of more than 6 million late Parisians. That's nearly 3 times the current living population of the city of Paris, which tops out at around 2.2 million people. Visitors are greeted by a plaque that reads, "Stop. This is the Empire of Death." But, in French. After inspecting the bones, visitors climb 112 steps to leave the catacombs and return to street level. Naturally, this also involves exiting through a gift shop. During the World War II Nazi occupation of France, the catacombs provided Parisians with a handy hiding place. 2 doctors, named Jean Talleyrand and René Sutel, began mapping the tunnels in 1938 and handed the work over to French resistance leader Henri Roll-Tanguy for use as storage or hideouts. The Grand Mosque of Paris also took advantage of its location, directly above an entrance into the tunnels, to serve as a hiding place for Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazi regime. Jews would wait in the catacombs until they could be provided with forged identity papers and routes out of the country. Some historians also have suggested that German occupiers may have also made use of the catacombs to travel around the city, but without the benefits of a handy map or a local guide. The tunnels have allowed for covert movement around the city during peacetime as well. In 2017, thieves burrowed through the wall of one of the tunnels to access a private wine cellar nearly 65 feet below the streets of Paris. More than 300 bottles of vintage Grand Cru wines were taken, at an estimated value of around 250,000 euros. The future could theoretically hold even more surprising uses for the tunnel network beneath Paris. One Paris architectural firm, known as Fieldwork, has started experimenting with the catacombs as a source of geothermal energy due to their constant warm temperatures. Theoretically, they could be used to help regulate temperatures throughout the city, naturally keeping homes in the area cool during the summer and warm in the winter. Historians point to a wide variety of causes for the French Revolution, but they all agree that the excess enjoyed by the ruling class was the major factor. Isolating themselves in a distant country palace, the king and his court made one out-of-touch decision after another. Their increasing extravagance led the French people to question the role of the monarchy and wonder if the time hadn't come for a more democratic form of government. Today, we're going to take a look at 11 ways a corrupt and elite ruling class led to the French Revolution. Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, ruled France by cultivating and controlling a royal cult centered around himself. The cult was carefully managed and, to no one's surprise, entirely excluded the nation's working class and poor. In fact, in 1682, Louis moved the capital to Versailles, a hunting lodge he owned outside of Paris. It was from there that the monarchy would rule until 1789. At the highly isolated Versailles, the royals and their court became lost in a maze of protocol, ritual, and hedonism that almost completely cut them off from the day-to-day existence of regular Parisians. Finally, on October 4, 1789, thousands of Parisian women marched the 12 miles to Versailles and demanded King Louis and the other royals return to the city with them. After 24 hours of protests, the king agreed to head back to Gay Paris. Louis XVI was famous for being a faithful husband. However, his grandfather, Louis XV, infamously was not. The French probably wouldn't have judged him too harshly for his infidelities had these women been merely companions. But Louis had a frustrating habit of giving his mistresses official state power. One of those mistresses, known as Madame de Pompadour, became highly influential in Louis's politics and even advised him on several international issues. In modern terms, it would be as if JFK made Marilyn Monroe the Secretary of State. The people of France saw Pompadour's undue influence as despotic, and their unhappiness began to ferment into a revolutionary spirit. Marie Antoinette had some pretty expensive tastes, and to the people of France, their foreign-born queen became the personification of extravagance in the royal court. One of her pricey habits was a deep and abiding love of chocolate. Many previous French royals were also chocoholics, but Antoinette loved the stuff so much she actually brought her very own chocolate chef with her from Vienna. He was given the title Chocolate Maker to the Queen, and his entire job consisted of inventing new chocolate-centered recipes for Her Royal Highness, like a French Willy Wonka. At the end of the 18th century, chocolate was becoming more widely available to the masses, but was still considered an elite treat. This is probably why it didn't do much for Marie's public image when it became known that she started each and every day with a steaming hot cup of cocoa with whipped cream. Coupled with her expensive appetite for the latest fashions and a personal stylist whose sole job was to create over-the-top hairstyles, the Queen became a public enemy. When Louis XVI ascended to the throne in 1774, he gave Marie Antoinette a small palace on the Versailles estate called Petit Trianon. Sparing no expense, which seemed to be her typical MO, Antoinette had the palace, which had originally been built for Madame de Pompadour, completely redesigned to fit her own tastes and aesthetics. Petit Trianon became Antoinette's retreat from the confines of court life. The palace had an English garden and farm where Marie could live out what she considered an ideal rural existence. Ironically, the very privacy and peace that she sought from her time at Petit Trianon made her the target of even more criticism. The public thought her retreats were tantamount to a rejection of her role in royal politics. They suspected she only wanted privacy because she was likely up to no good. The behavior of the king and the royal family wasn't the only factor that brought on the revolution. The overly favorable treatment of the French aristocracy, which was closely tied to the monarchy, was another contributing cause. In the centuries prior to the French Revolution, a tax known as taille came into being, and the responsibility for paying it fell on the shoulders of the peasants and the non-nobles. While the specific laws and rules governing this tax changed over time, the one thing that never changed was that the aristocracy was exempted from paying it. It was a direct tax based on land ownership, but it was far from the only tax non-nobles were subjected to. As for the aristocracy, all that money they saved on taxes was spent lavishly on masquerade balls, gambled away at card tables and casinos, and used to build magnificent estates. Not surprisingly, resentment towards the aristocracy grew and became a major reason for the advent of the Revolution. In 1778, the United States was deep into the American Revolution against Great Britain. France, not being terribly fond of the British, recognized the U.S. as a sovereign country and pledged to support them militarily. However, helping a disorganized band of upstart rebels take on the world's most formidable empire was not cheap. The continuation of the French and Indian War, a long-standing conflict with the British fought in the New World, cost the French 1.3 billion livres, which today is equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars. With the financial crisis of the 1780s still not over, support of the American cause sank France even deeper into debt. It became just one more grievance that led to revolution. There were numerous reasons that led to the revolution. However, not all of them were true. Conspiracy theories, gossip, rumors, and scandals were equally responsible for shaping public perceptions about the ruling class. And by the late 1780s, those perceptions were anything but positive. One such rumor concerned the so-called Pacte de Famine. France had experienced frequent famines and food shortages, and a conspiracy theory that explained it began to take hold. The theory held that the royal family was withholding food from the commoners and hoarding it for themselves and other elites. These chronic food shortages are, perhaps, what later led to the belief that Marie Antoinette had coldly dismissed the plight of her people with the words, "Let them eat cake." However, while the hunger was real, the quote was not. It actually came from a book by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who attributed it to a young princess. Marie was only 9 when the book was published, so most likely it wasn't her. Prior to the Revolution, France was a stratified society broken up into social classes known as estates. Built on the medieval-era world order, there were 3 estates. The first was the clergy, the second was the nobility, and the third was absolutely everyone else, from wealthy merchants to poor farmers. When the king called upon them, which was admittedly rare, the 3 estates would convene as a sort of parliament. Such was the case in 1789, when a financial crisis finally moved Louis XVI to throw caution to the wind and call a meeting of the Estates General. It did not go well. The Third Estate, who don't forget included the poor and downtrodden, attempted to seize more political influence and agency from the other 2. The king, who was not having it, decided to do something incredibly petty. He physically locked the Third Estate representatives out of the meeting. As you can imagine, they weren't happy. Their representatives reconvened at a nearby tennis court, where they vowed to write a constitution that would correct all of the wrongs that infected the ruling classes of France. While it's believed that Louis XVI had good intentions, he was not great at politics, often making decisions that were a bit tone-deaf. For example, take the case of Jacques Necker, the minister of France, whom the king fired. The problem was that although Louis didn't realize it, Necker had become a hero among the common folk. The popular minister had championed several financial reforms and tried to communicate the state's financial situation to the populace at large. The royals, for their part, decided to blame him for a mounting debt crisis. Marie Antoinette herself was one of his most formidable enemies. So when her husband dismissed Necker on July 11, 1789, the French people did not take it well. The move reinforced the growing sentiment that the king was corrupt, and just 3 days later, a group of Parisians stormed the Bastille, igniting the powder keg of revolution. When the revolution came, not every member of the French royal family was opposed to it. In fact, at least one junior member of the royal Bourbon family was a very active participant. That man was Louis-Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans and Prince of the Blood. Prior to the Revolution, Louis-Philippe and his wife didn't have the best relationship with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. At the same time, they were very popular with the common people of Paris. During the Revolution, Louis-Philippe and his wife threw their lot in with the revolutionaries and even provided direct aid to the infamous Jacobins. The loyalty Louis-Philippe showed to the Revolution and the people of France was, sadly, not enough to save him. On the 6th of November, 1793, he would follow the rest of his family to the guillotine. Unlike his grandfather, who had a rep for being a self-interested hedonist, Louis XVI took his job as king seriously. Early in his reign, he showed great competence at the job, but in the end, not so much. The only thing Louis proved to be truly effective at was motivating the people of France to end the monarchy once and for all. It is said that Louis, who was known to be quite shy, lacked the confidence in his own ability to make decisions and grew increasingly doubtful that he had what it took to solve France's complex problems. He became overwhelmed and slowly withdrew from the political world. These characteristics are typical of depression, which has led some historians to suggest that Louis may have suffered from the condition. The people of France, however, didn't care much for the reasons behind Louis's failures. His introverted behavior won him few admirers and only convinced the public that he was unfit to rule. And on January 21, 1793, Louis was beheaded at the Place de la Révolution. Perhaps nothing was more decadent about French aristocrats before the Revolution than their over-the-top meals. Aristocrats of France's ancient regime, or Old Order, tended to have elaborate meals, thanks to the fact that they could afford it. They procured expensive ingredients and hired master chefs to create mouth-watering dishes, while everyone else in the country starved. Today, we're looking at some of the frivolous foods eaten by the French aristocracy as the peasants went hungry. Okay, time to let them eat cake and chocolate, and a bunch of other fancy stuff too. When Marie Antoinette, a young princess from Vienna who became the final queen of France before the Revolution, first arrived at court, she didn't come alone. In her retinue was none other than her personal chocolate chef, which is quite possibly the wealthiest thing we've ever heard. Among the many concoctions he whipped up for the queen was chocolate with orange blossoms, which yielded a rich, citrusy flavor. Marie Antoinette's love of chocolate was hardly unique among the old-timey crowd. Men, women, and children in the 18th century had become wild about chocolate, and it was a treat reserved for the upper class. Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles was basically an aristocratic universe of ritual and decadence, with Louis firmly at the center. Like the king himself, who took dinner alone in his chambers in a highly ritualized manner, the courtiers of Versailles ate well. The food was just as over-the-top as their costumes and hairstyles, especially since aristocrats tried to one-up each other with their menus, like a pre-revolution master chef. For example, included on the menu at the Marquis de Louvois' banquet in 1690 were poached truffles. Truffles, which are decadent and expensive even today, would have been a delicious treat for the Marquis's hyper-privileged guests. Interestingly, in the preceding centuries, aristocrats wouldn't have been caught dead eating truffles. Because they came from the ground, they were considered to be peasant food. Basically, truffles were strictly for the poors, until the moment a rich person tried one. Sort of like rabbit, lobster, and living in a tiny apartment in Manhattan. Oysters are a popular modern-day treat, but the aristocrats of pre-revolutionary France really went wild for them. Getting oysters and other seafood to the tables of the ruling class was no easy feat. Fishermen and sellers in Paris developed a system over time that got seafood to the Paris markets early in the morning, so that it could reach the aristocrats later in the day. So beloved were oysters amongst French high society that ensuring one's employer had a ready supply of them was sometimes a stressful task. One chef, François Vatel, actually offed himself with his own sword after a delivery for a banquet failed to arrive. It might have been less an honor thing and more of a I'd rather die than keep dealing with a thing. Oddly enough, the period leading up to the French Revolution saw an increase in the number of cookbooks that were published. But these definitely were not like modern-day cookbooks. Directions were often vague, and they did not use standard measurements. Add a thackeray of smudge and steam your bobbies for no less than a quarter turn of the jerry tree. So, like a teaspoon? Is this food or a paint recipe? Still, these cookbooks are a window into the world of gourmet cooking in the 18th century, especially as chefs tried to appeal to the elite's appetite for novelty foods that would surprise their guests. One such dish was the delicious-sounding chicken in bagpipes. However, rather than a woodwind instrument stuffed with the Colonel's 11 herbs and spices, this dish involved chickens that were cooked in lamb bladders, which the cook was supposed to inflate, like bagpipes. Contrary to popular belief, Marie Antoinette was never really comfortable with the elaborate public dinners that had become ritualized at Versailles. In fact, she rarely ate in public and preferred to eat in private. But occasionally, she was known to have some decadent meals from time to time. Among them was breaded foie gras, duck or goose liver, which is considered as decadent as it is unappetizing. Organ meat rolled in panko? Oh, no thanks. I ate on the way to the palace. As Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour was one of the most influential women of the 18th century. But her power extended far beyond the royal bedchamber. As a patron of the arts, she often entertained and even employed her own chef. Among the food prepared for Pompadour and her guests was stomachs of riverside birds with sand leek sauce. The only thing tastier than a bird stomach is a bird stomach full of sandy vegetable juice. As truly unappetizing as it sounds, it's also an important lesson. By the middle of the 18th century, the elite class in France often crafted their menus for the effect and shock value, rather than the food itself. Sort of like if Marilyn Manson became a celebrity chef. If history shows us anything, it's that rich people get bored very easily. Though all expensive wines were welcome at Versailles, one towered over the rest: champagne. Following techniques introduced by a 17th century monk named Dom Perignon, the name primarily associated with champagne today, champagne became a popular drink among the purse-laden. Specifically, Louis XIV notably loved champagne, though the bubbly beverage's popularity at Versailles would outlast the Sun King. Rumor has it that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette rang in the new year with champagne, which would mean they started a New Year's tradition that continues to this day. Drinking water in an age before mass purification could be a risky business. One sip of the wrong batch could send you swiftly to your deathbed. So it's no surprise that Marie Antoinette was persnickety about her water, especially after she discovered the only water that did not make her ill came from a spring at Ville d'Avray, near Versailles. She refused to drink water from any other source. And while the spring was only a few miles away from the palace, someone still had to go fetch it for her on a regular basis. And that someone's name was definitely not Marie Antoinette. She was even allowed Ville d'Avray's water when she was imprisoned during the French Revolution. Now that is privilege. I wonder what vintage her toilet wine was. Brioche has a long history. The word was actually first used all the way back in the 15th century. But brioche as a rich, buttery bread began to develop in the 18th century. French aristocrats in particular fell hard for this hunk of starchy goodness. The elite class could afford more butter and flour, so their brioches were far richer and more heavenly than those of the peasant classes. The croquette, a savory breaded roll filled with meat, was hardly unique to France. In fact, versions of it exist in one form or another all around the world. But François Massulotte, one of the talented chefs working at Versailles, developed his own version, and the recipe appears in his cookbook, first published in 1691. Massulotte's version was stuffed with a ragout, but he also made it with truffles and cream cheese. Dinner in the pre-revolution court wasn't just a social occasion. It could be an aesthetic experience for royal foodies, even before Instagram. As such, how food was presented was part of the pleasure of dining. One cookbook from the 18th century includes a recipe for pumpkin soup that was to be served in a hollowed-out pumpkin that had been coated with meringue. Eating a novelty dish out of an actual jack-o'-lantern sounds like something you'd find in Flavortown, but it would have been featured at the highest of high society feasts in France. Speaking of meringue, like many foods, historians can't quite pin down the origins of the sweet treat. Some even claim that Queen Maria Leszczyńska, the Polish wife of King Louis XV, brought meringue with her to the French court. But wherever it came from originally, it was a regular fixture at Versailles. Rumor also had it that Marie Antoinette loved to eat meringue. Let them eat meringue. Yeah, that doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? Kind of sounds like an exhausted wedding DJ. One of the most important names associated with French pastries is Nicolas Strauer. Strauer got his work starting in the Polish royal court, and when Princess Maria Leszczyńska traveled to France to marry the young King Louis XV, Strauer came with her. You know you'd bring your personal cake chef if you had one. Strauer introduced the baba cake to the Versailles court, and they went mad for it. Baba, which is simply the French word for what is essentially a Polish bundt cake, was a cake that was soaked in fortified wine. If you were a sugar junkie or an alcoholic, and royal courts tended to be full of both, this was the stuff of dreams. The many-layered millefeuille, also known today as Napoleons, was a specialty of 18th century pastry chefs. After all, the elite were attracted to delicate foods in the 18th century, and there was perhaps nothing more delicate than a multi-layered pastry. The 18th century version differed from the modern one in a key respect. Instead of cream holding together each layer, 18th century pastry chefs used jam, like a bougie PB&J. Queen Maria Leczinska may not have received much love in her own lifetime, considering her husband King Louis XV was infamous for keeping mistresses. But she had a big part in the evolution of French cuisine. In fact, one popular dish from the court of Versailles was even named in her honor. Bouchée à la reine is a savory pastry typically made with chicken and mushrooms, although it can also include veal sweetbreads or ham, or even seafood if you're feeling it. Having a scrumptious dish named in your honor almost does make up for the fact that your husband tried to sleep with every woman in France. Almost. So what do you think? Which of these dishes would you like to try the most? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.